They said a black man couldn't be a cowboy. That someone born into slavery had no business riding the open range, competing with white men, or claiming a place in the Wild West. They laughed at the very idea. A former slave becoming a champion roper? Winning shooting contests against the best marksman in the territory? Earning a legendary nickname that would echo through history? Impossible, they said. Yet on July 4th, 1876, in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, a young black cowboy would prove them all wrong. He would rope, tie, saddle, and mount a wild mustang in 9 minutes flat, nearly 4 minutes faster than any other competitor. He would place 14 rifle shots in the bullseye from 250 yards, shooting from the hip. And when the dust settled and the crowd roared, they would give him a name that would become legend: Deadwood Dick. This is the story of Nat Love, the man who refused to let the color of his skin define the limits of his ambition. But before we dive into this incredible journey, I need your help. This channel exists because of viewers like you who are passionate about untold history. If you want to see more stories like this, stories of people who changed the world despite everything stacked against them, tell me in the comments what historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And if you believe these stories deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. Your support keeps me motivated to spend weeks researching and crafting these videos. Every subscription tells me that history, real history, not the sanitized version, matters to you. Now, let's meet the man who became a legend. June 14th, 1854, Davidson County, Tennessee. On the plantation of Robert Love, a baby boy was born into slavery. His name was Nat Love, though the exact date of his birth would never be properly recorded. As Nat himself would later write, "The exact date of my birth I never knew, because in those days no count was kept of such trivial matters as the birth of a slave baby. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of society, this child was property. Not a person with hopes and dreams and potential, but a commodity, an asset, something to be bought, sold, worked, and discarded when no longer useful." His father, Samson, was a slave foreman who worked in the plantation's fields. His mother managed the kitchen of the big house, preparing meals for the family that claimed to own her, her husband, and her children. Nat had 2 siblings, an older sister named Sally and an older brother named Jordan. The 3 children grew up in a log cabin, rough-hewn and drafty, worlds away from the comfortable plantation house where white children played without chains. But even in bondage, something extraordinary was happening. Despite slavery-era statutes that outlawed black literacy, laws designed specifically to keep enslaved people ignorant and controllable, Nat's father, Samson, was teaching his son to read and write. Picture this: a slave foreman, exhausted from a day of forced labor under the southern sun, sitting by candlelight with his young son, teaching him letters and words. Every lesson was an act of rebellion. Every word Nat learned was a tiny crack in the foundation of slavery itself. Samson knew something the slave owners didn't want to admit. Knowledge was power, and he was giving his son a weapon more dangerous than any gun. Nat was primarily looked after by his older sister Sally, but she too had duties in the kitchen alongside their mother. So young, Nat learned early to fend for himself, to be observant, to watch and learn. He studied the world around him with keen eyes, noting everything: the way horses moved, the patterns of weather, the tells that gave away when someone was lying. The skills that would later make him legendary weren't taught in any formal way. They were forged in the fire of survival, honed by a child who understood instinctively that he would need every advantage he could get. Then came April 1865. The Civil War ended, the Confederacy fell, and across the South, 4 million enslaved people learned they were free. For the Love family, freedom came with a harsh reality. They were no longer property, but they had nothing. No land, no money, no resources except the clothes on their backs and the skills in their hands. Robert Love, their former owner, offered them a deal. Stay on the plantation as sharecroppers. Work the land, plant tobacco and corn, and maybe, scraped together enough to survive. Samson Love took the deal. What choice did he have? He rented about 20 acres from the man who had once owned him, and he threw himself into the work with the desperate hope of all newly freed people. That hard work and determination could build a better life. He planted his first crop, then his second. But freedom, it turned out, came with new kinds of chains. Sharecropping was designed to keep black farmers perpetually in debt, perpetually dependent, perpetually trapped. The system was rigged, and Samson Love, for all his strength and determination, couldn't beat it. Shortly after planting that second crop, Samson died. Whether from exhaustion, illness, or the cumulative toll of a lifetime of forced labor, we don't know. What we do know is that his death left the family in desperate circumstances. Nat, barely into his teenage years, suddenly became the man of the house. His mother, his brother Jordan, his sister Sally, they all needed him. The romantic notion of freedom crashed hard against the brutal reality of survival in the post-war South. Nat took any job he could find. He worked from sunrise to sunset and then found more work by moonlight. The hard work from morning to night that sharecropping demanded began to wear on him. But more than the physical exhaustion, it was the trapped feeling that got to him. The sense that no matter how hard he worked, he would never get ahead. That Tennessee, for all its talk of freedom, was just slavery by another name. As he would later write, these conditions made him start thinking about going west because freedom is sweet, and he wanted to make more of his life. Then came the moment that would change everything. A neighbor was running a raffle for a horse. 50 cents for a ticket. Nat scraped together the money and bought one ticket. Against all odds, he won. A fine horse, worth far more than anything his family owned. But Nat didn't keep it. He sold the horse back to the raffle manager for $50, a small fortune. Then, in a move that seemed too lucky to be real, the same neighbor ran another raffle for the same horse. Nat bought another ticket and won again, another $50. He had $100, more money than he'd ever seen in his life. He took $50 home to his mother, enough to keep the family fed for months. The other $50, that was for him. That was for freedom. At 15 years old, barely more than a boy, Nat Love made a decision that would define his life. He would go west. He would leave behind everything he knew, everyone he loved, and strike out for a place where maybe, just maybe, a black man could truly be free. His mother understood. Of course she did. What parent wouldn't want their child to escape the suffocating racism of the South, to find a place where hard work actually led to something better? So, she let him go. And in 1869, with $50 in his pocket and a heart full of hope and terror in equal measure, Nat Love walked away from Tennessee. He didn't know where he was going, not exactly. He'd heard stories of the West, tales of wide-open spaces and cattle ranches and men judged by their skill rather than their skin color. He didn't know if those stories were true, but he knew Tennessee offered him nothing but a lifetime of backbreaking labor and crushing poverty. So he chose the unknown. He chose to bet everything on himself, and that choice would make him a legend. Imagine being 15 years old, alone, traveling through a country that still saw you as less than human. Nat Love's journey west was not some romantic adventure. It was dangerous, terrifying. Every town he passed through, he risked being accused of some crime he didn't commit, being attacked by white men who resented seeing a young black man traveling freely. The further west he went, the more he left behind the world he knew, and the more he realized he was stepping into something entirely different. His destination was Dodge City, Kansas. He'd heard it was a place where cowboys gathered, where cattle drives began, where a man with skills could find work. When he arrived, he found a town that lived up to its reputation as wild and lawless. Dodge City was, as Nat himself described it, a typical frontier city, with a great many saloons, dance halls, and gambling houses, and very little of anything else. It was loud, violent, and utterly indifferent to whether you lived or died. Perfect, in other words, for a young man looking to reinvent himself. Nat walked into a scene that would determine his entire future. A group of cowboys from the Duval Ranch were having breakfast after bringing a herd to the Kansas railhead. These were hard men, weathered by the trail, comfortable with danger. Several of them were black, which was common. Historians now estimate that 1 in 4 cowboys in the Old West were African American. But that didn't mean the work was easy, or that prejudice didn't exist. It just meant that on the trail, in the middle of nowhere, with your life depending on the men around you, skill mattered more than skin color. Nat approached the trail boss and asked for a job. The boss looked at this skinny 15-year-old kid and said essentially, "Prove it." If Nat could break a horse named Goodeye, the wildest, meanest bronco in the outfit, he could have the job. It was a test, and everyone knew it. They expected the kid to fail, maybe get thrown, maybe get hurt, maybe run away. Instead, Nat Love climbed onto Goodeye's back and proceeded to have the ride of his life. Goodeye bucked, twisted, tried every trick a wild horse knows to throw a rider. Nat held on. His hands gripped the reins so tight his knuckles went white. His legs clamped around the horse's sides. Goodeye spun and reared, crashed through a fence, tried to scrape Nat off against a post. Still, Nat held on. The cowboys watching started to take notice. This wasn't luck. This kid had something. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, Goodeye began to tire. The bucking slowed, the spinning stopped, and Nat Love remained in the saddle, victorious. The trail boss offered him $30 a month, standard wages for a cowboy, and Nat accepted immediately. Just like that, at 16 years old, he became a cowboy for the Duval Ranch. It was 1869, and his real education was about to begin. The work was brutal. Cowboys worked from before dawn until after dark, 7 days a week. They drove cattle across hundreds of miles of rough terrain, through rivers that could drown you, over mountains that tested the limits of horse and human endurance. They faced extreme weather, blizzards that could freeze you to death, heat waves that baked the moisture from your body, storms that turned dry creek beds into raging torrents in minutes. And then there were the dangers that came with 2 legs, cattle rustlers who would kill you for a herd, outlaws who saw a lone cowboy as an easy target, and the fraught, complicated, often violent interactions with Native American tribes whose land these cattle drives crossed. Nat would later write about multiple encounters with indigenous people, some peaceful, some deadly. He wasn't romanticizing it. This was the reality of the frontier, where different peoples with different claims to the land met in circumstances that often ended in bloodshed. But Nat didn't just survive, he excelled. He threw himself into learning every skill a cowboy needed. He practiced with his .45 revolver until his shooting became not just good, but exceptional. He learned to read cattle brands, to spot disease in livestock, to predict weather by watching the sky and smelling the air. He studied how to track animals and men across terrain that revealed few secrets. He learned which plants were edible, where to find water in country that looked bone dry, how to start a fire in the rain, how to survive when everything went wrong. Within just a few years, Nat had earned a reputation as one of the best all-around cowboys in the Duval outfit. His marksmanship became talked about. His ability to handle difficult horses, the ones other cowboys refused to ride, became legendary among his crew. He moved from simple ranch hand to buyer and chief brand reader, positions of real responsibility. For a young black man barely out of his teens, this was extraordinary. In the South, he would have been limited by law and custom to the most menial work. Out here, on the range, what mattered was whether you could do the job. In 1872, Nat moved to Arizona to work for the Gallinger Ranch along the Gila River. This opened up new territory for him, literally and figuratively. He made numerous trips into Mexico, expanding his world even further. He learned to speak Spanish fluently, adding another skill to his growing arsenal. The work remained dangerous, perhaps even more so. Cattle thieves operated freely along the border. The Apache and other tribes were still fighting to defend their ancestral lands. Every day brought new challenges, new threats, new opportunities to prove himself or get killed. Nat Love was becoming something special, not just a cowboy, but a master of the craft. He traveled over all the important western trails between the Gulf of Mexico and Montana. He learned the land like few others could, and crucially, he was building a reputation. Word spread among cowboys and ranchers about this young black man who feared nothing, who could outride and outshoot men twice his age, who handled responsibility with maturity beyond his years. He would later write about this period with obvious fondness. What man, with the fire of life and youth and health in his veins, could not rejoice in such a life? For Nat, the frontier represented something Tennessee never could, a place where he was measured by his abilities, not the color of his skin. Yes, racism existed. Yes, he faced discrimination in the cattle towns when drives ended. But on the trail, in the work, among the men who depended on him and whom he depended on, he found something approaching equality. He found purpose. He found pride. And he was preparing for the moment that would make him a legend. By the summer of 1876, Nat Love had been a cowboy for 7 years. He was 22 years old and had already lived a life most men couldn't imagine. He'd driven cattle through 8 states. He'd fought off rustlers and survived encounters with hostile forces that left other men dead. He'd mastered skills that took most cowboys a lifetime to learn, but he was still, in the broader world, unknown. Just another cowboy among thousands. That was about to change. The Gallinger Ranch assigned Nat and his crew to deliver 3,000 head of steers to Deadwood, Dakota Territory. Deadwood was a boomtown, created almost overnight by the discovery of gold in the Black Hills. Miners flooded in by the thousands, desperate for fortune, and where miners went, everyone else followed. Gamblers, saloon keepers, prostitutes, merchants, and yes, cowboys bringing beef to feed the hungry masses. The town was lawless, violent, and absolutely electric with possibility. Nat's crew arrived in Deadwood on July 3rd, 1876. The timing was perfect. The town was preparing for its 4th of July celebration, and the mining men and gamblers had banded together to organize a cowboying contest. They set aside $200 in prize money, a substantial sum, more than 6 months' wages for most cowboys. The competition would test the core skills of cowboy life: roping, riding, and shooting. Every cowboy in town would be welcome to compete, and compete they did. July 4th, 1876, dawned clear and hot. The town was buzzing with excitement. This wasn't just about the contest. This was Deadwood celebrating its existence, its defiance of the wilderness, its rough and tumble version of American independence. The crowd gathered, drinking and betting and shouting, eager to see which cowboy would prove himself the best. Nat stood among the competitors, and he knew what they saw: a young black man, clearly capable given his gear and bearing, but still an unknown, an outsider. The first event was the riding and roping competition. Each cowboy had to rope a wild mustang from the herd, throw it to the ground, bridle it, saddle it, and mount it, all while the clock was ticking. These weren't gentle horses. These were wild animals, unbroken, mean, and determined not to be ridden. Most cowboys took 12 minutes or more. Some couldn't complete it at all, getting thrown or losing control of their horse before they could mount. The crowd watched each attempt, cheering for the local favorites, placing bets on who would win. Then came Nat Love's turn. The gun cracked to signal the start. Nat moved with speed and precision that seemed almost supernatural. His lariat flew through the air and settled perfectly around the Mustang's neck. He pulled the horse down, his movements economical and practiced. While the horse thrashed and fought, Nat got the bridle on, then the saddle. And then, this was the part that separated good cowboys from legends. He mounted the still fighting animal. From the crack of the starting gun to the moment he sat in the saddle, fully in control. 9 minutes flat. The crowd went quiet, then erupted. 9 minutes. The next closest competitor had taken 12 minutes and 30 seconds, nearly 4 minutes longer. Nat had smoked the competition, but he wasn't done. Next came the shooting contests. and this was where Nat would truly make his name. The first competition was rifle shooting at targets placed 100 and 250 yards away. 14 shots total. Most cowboys were good shots. You had to be to survive on the range, but hitting a target at 250 yards consistently was something else entirely. Nat stepped up to the line with his rifle. He didn't take a standard shooting stance, getting down on one knee or bracing the rifle carefully. Instead, he shot from the hip, a technique that was flashier, but far more difficult. It required an almost instinctive feel for where the barrel was pointing, a unity of hand and eye that few marksmen ever achieved. His first shot rang out. Bullseye. Second shot. Bullseye. Again and again, with the crowd growing louder with each impossible shot, Nat Love placed all 14 rounds in the center of the target. The shooting contest continued with pistols, targets at 150 yards. Again, Nat dominated, placing 12 of 14 shots in the bullseye. When the final scores were tallied, there was no doubt about the winner. Nat Love had won every competition. The $200 prize was his. But more importantly, he'd earned something money couldn't buy: respect and a nickname. The crowd, amazed by what they'd witnessed, started calling him Deadwood Dick. The name was already famous. It belonged to a character in popular dime novels written by Edward Lytton Wheeler. Deadwood Dick was a legendary outlaw and hero of the West, known for his riding skills and dead aim shooting. Some scholars believe the character was based partly on Wild Bill Hickok, partly on Buffalo Bill Cody, partly on pure imagination. But on July 4th, 1876, in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, a real man claimed that legendary name. There's some controversy about whether the rodeo happened exactly as Nat described it. Deadwood newspapers covered the 4th of July celebrations extensively, but they make no mention of this specific rodeo. Some historians suggest Nat may have embellished the story or conflated different events. But here's what we know for certain. Nat Love was a real cowboy with real skills. Multiple sources confirm his exceptional abilities with horses and guns. And whether the Deadwood contest happened exactly as he described or not, the nickname stuck. For the rest of his life, Nat Love would be known as Deadwood Dick. What's often lost in discussions about whether Nat exaggerated is the larger truth. He was claiming space in American mythology. The West was being romanticized, even as it was being settled. Dime novels created larger-than-life heroes, almost all of them white. By taking the name Deadwood Dick, by telling his story boldly and unapologetically, Nat Love was asserting that black men belonged in that mythology too. He was saying, "I did this. I was there. I was one of the best. Remember my name." And the West did remember. From that point forward, Nat Love was Deadwood Dick. Cowboys who met him knew they were meeting someone special. When he rode into a new town with a cattle drive, his reputation preceded him. The young black man who'd been born a slave in Tennessee was now a legend of the frontier, and his adventures were just beginning. After Deadwood, Nat Love's reputation opened doors that had been closed to most black cowboys. He remained with the Gallinger Ranch in Arizona, but now he was Deadwood Dick, the champion roper and shooter. That reputation brought both opportunity and danger. Opportunity because ranchers wanted the best men they could get, and Nat had proven he was among the best. Danger because being known meant being tested. Every young cowboy looking to make a name wanted to challenge the legend. Every cattle thief and outlaw knew who he was, which made him a target. Nat embraced both the opportunity and the danger. For the next 15 years, he lived the cowboy life to its fullest. He made countless cattle drives, taking herds from Texas to Montana, from Arizona to Kansas. He learned every major trail in the West: the Goodnight Loving Trail, the Chisholm Trail, the Western Trail, the Shawnee Trail. Each had its own challenges, its own dangers, its own legends, and Nat added his own stories to each one. The work remained as brutal as ever. A typical cattle drive could last months. Picture this. You're responsible for moving thousands of head of cattle across hundreds of miles. You're in the saddle before dawn and don't dismount until well after dark. You eat dust all day, breathing in the grit kicked up by thousands of hooves. At night, you take turns on watch because cattle can stampede at the slightest provocation. A thunderstorm, a wolf, sometimes just because one cow got spooked and the panic spread. Stampedes were one of the most dangerous aspects of cowboy life, and Nat experienced plenty of them. When a herd of 3,000 cattle suddenly decides to run in blind panic, nothing can stop them. Cowboys had to ride alongside, shouting and firing guns to try to turn the herd, to get the lead steers running in a circle until the whole mass tired itself out. Men died in stampedes, trampled under thousands of hooves, or thrown from their horses in the chaos. Nat survived multiple stampedes through a combination of skill, courage, and what he called his charmed life. Then there were the encounters with people who wanted what the cowboys were protecting. Cattle rustlers were a constant threat, especially near the Mexican border and in remote territories. These weren't romantic outlaws. They were thieves, willing to kill for profit. Nat wrote about multiple gunfights with rustlers. In the Code of the West, you didn't shoot to wound or scare off threats. You shot to kill, or you died. Nat survived because he was faster and more accurate than the men trying to kill him. His practice with his .45 revolver paid off again and again. His encounters with Native American tribes were more complex. The tribes whose land these cattle drives crossed had every right to be hostile. The American expansion westward was destroying their way of life, killing off the buffalo they depended on, pushing them onto reservations. Some tribes demanded payment for crossing their land, essentially a toll. Smart trail bosses paid it. The cost of a few cattle was nothing compared to the cost of a fight. But other encounters ended violently. Nat wrote about battles with Apache warriors, with Pima bands, with various groups defending their territory. In these accounts, he's matter-of-fact about the violence, neither glorifying it nor apologizing for it. It was simply part of the reality of frontier life. The most dramatic of these encounters, according to Nat's autobiography, happened in October 1877. He was rounding up stray cattle near the Gila River in Arizona when he was captured by a band of Pima warriors. In the fight before his capture, he was shot multiple times. He claims 14 bullet wounds in total over his career, with several received in this particular encounter. He was certain he would be killed. Instead, something unexpected happened. The Pima warriors, Nat wrote, respected his courage in the fight. Moreover, many in the band were of mixed blood, with African ancestry themselves. Rather than killing him, they nursed him back to health. The chief was impressed enough to offer Nat 100 ponies and his daughter's hand in marriage if Nat would join the tribe permanently. Nat lived with them for about a month, learning their ways, considering the offer. Ultimately, he chose to return to his cowboy life. He stole a pony, one of the finest in the band, and escaped, riding 100 miles in 12 hours to get back to his outfit. Some historians question this story's accuracy. There are elements that seem too dramatic, too perfectly plotted, like a dime novel. But whether every detail is true, or Nat embellished some parts, the core truth remains. He survived deadly encounters that killed other men. And his survival wasn't just luck. It was skill, toughness, and an ability to think clearly under pressure that separated him from ordinary cowboys. During these years, Nat claimed to have met many of the legends of the West. He wrote about meeting Billy the Kid, sharing drinks and conversation with the young outlaw. He claimed to have known Pat Garrett, the lawman who would eventually shoot Billy the Kid. He said he met Bat Masterson, the famous gambler and gunfighter. He supposedly encountered Buffalo Bill Cody and Frank and Jesse James. About the James brothers, he wrote, "Their names are recorded in history as the most famous robbers of the New World. But to us, cowboys of the cattle country who knew them well, they were true men, brave, kind, generous, and loyal." Here's the thing about these claims. Some can be verified, some can't. Buffalo Bill and Bat Masterson certainly traveled the same regions Nat did. The James brothers operated in areas Nat visited. Billy the Kid spent time in territories where Nat worked. It's entirely plausible that paths crossed. Cowboys, outlaws, lawmen, scouts, they all moved through the same towns, the same saloons, the same trails. The West was big, but the world of people working in it was surprisingly small. Did Nat actually share drinks with Billy the Kid? We can't prove it, but we also can't prove he didn't. What we can prove is that Nat Love was there. He was a working cowboy during the heyday of the Wild West. He drove cattle through the territories where these legends operated. He possessed skills that put him at their level. Whether he personally knew every famous person he claimed to know is less important than this. He was part of that world. A black man born into slavery had earned his place among the cowboys, outlaws, and legends of the American frontier. That alone is remarkable. By the mid-1880s, Nat had become exactly what he set out to be, a master cowboy. He'd survived everything the West could throw at him. He'd proven himself against the best competitors, the worst outlaws, and the harshest conditions nature could produce. He'd gone from being property in Tennessee to being a free man commanding respect across the frontier. And he'd done it by being better, tougher, and more determined than anyone who doubted him. But the world was changing, and Nat Love, like all cowboys, would have to change with it or be left behind. By the late 1880s, the era of the great cattle drives was coming to an end. The forces of modernization, the very forces that had created the cowboy lifestyle, were now making it obsolete. Railroads had spread across the West like a steel spiderweb, reaching into territories that had once been accessible only by horseback. Cattle that used to need months-long drives to reach market could now be loaded onto trains and shipped in days. The efficiency was remarkable. The impact on cowboys was devastating. At the same time, barbed wire was revolutionizing ranching. The open range, where cattle roamed freely and cowboys drove them wherever they needed to go, was being carved up into private parcels. Ranchers could now fence their property, controlling exactly where their cattle grazed. This meant fewer stampedes, less theft, more orderly operations. It also meant fewer cowboys were needed. The skills that had made men like Nat Love valuable, the ability to drive cattle across 1,000 miles of open terrain, to navigate by stars, to survive weeks in the wilderness, suddenly mattered less than the ability to repair fence and manage smaller, contained herds. The settling of the West also brought law and order in ways that made the cowboy lifestyle less necessary. Native American tribes, after decades of resistance, had been forced onto reservations. The violence and uncertainty that had marked the frontier was giving way to established towns, territorial governments, and eventually, statehood. Oklahoma Territory, where Bass Reeves had hunted outlaws, was being settled by homesteaders. Arizona and New Mexico would soon become states. The Wild West was being domesticated, civilized, transformed into something more predictable, and, for cowboys, far less exciting. For Nat Love, as for thousands of other cowboys, this transformation posed a difficult question. What do you do when your way of life disappears? He'd been a cowboy since he was 16 years old. It was all he knew, all he'd trained for. More than that, it was his identity. He was Deadwood Dick, the champion roper, the man who'd proven he belonged among the best the West had to offer. How do you walk away from that? In his autobiography, Nat wrote about this period with obvious sadness. To us wild cowboys of the range, used to the wild and unrestricted life of the boundless plains, the new order of things did not appeal. Many of us became disgusted and quit the wildlife for the pursuits of our more civilized brother. The wording is telling. The new order didn't appeal, meaning he knew it was coming, knew it was inevitable, but hated it anyway. Many cowboys felt the same way. Some tried to hold on to the old ways, taking whatever ranch work they could find even as the industry contracted. Others turned to less legal pursuits, becoming outlaws themselves. Still others simply faded away, their skills no longer needed. But Nat Love was too practical, too intelligent to fight the inevitable. He'd spent his entire life adapting to circumstances. Born a slave, he'd adapted to freedom. Leaving Tennessee as a teenager, he'd adapted to the frontier. Learning Spanish and multiple indigenous languages, adapting to different cultures and situations. It was what he did. So when the cowboy era ended, he adapted again. On August 2nd, 1888, in Denver, Colorado, Nat married a woman named Alice. Little is recorded about Alice beyond her name, but the marriage represented a turning point. Nat was settling down, preparing for a different kind of life. In 1890, at age 36, Nat took a job as a Pullman porter on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. For someone who'd spent 2 decades on horseback, living rough, sleeping under stars, this might have seemed like a massive come-down. Pullman porters were essentially luxury servants, overseeing sleeping cars on trains, attending to wealthy passengers' needs. The work required deference, formality, adherence to rules, everything that seemed opposite to the free life of a cowboy. Yet Nat approached it with the same determination he'd brought to breaking horses and winning shooting contests. The Pullman Company employed thousands of black men as porters. It was one of the few jobs that offered steady employment, decent wages, and the opportunity to travel. For many African Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, being a Pullman porter represented upward mobility. You wore a uniform, worked for a prestigious company, and saw parts of the country most black people would never visit. But the job also reinforced racial hierarchies. Porters were expected to be subservient to white passengers, to tolerate insults and indignities with a smile, to fade into the background while ensuring every passenger's comfort. Nat Love, who'd lived as freely as any black man in America could in that era, who'd competed as an equal with white cowboys and earned respect through skill rather than deference, was now expected to bow and scrape. How did he handle it? Pragmatically. He needed the income. He had a wife, and eventually a child, to support. The cowboy life was over whether he liked it or not. And the Pullman job had one major advantage. It let him keep moving. During my service with the Pullman Company, I have traveled from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and from the Gulf of Mexico to the borders of Canada, he wrote. I have visited all the principal cities and towns where the sound of the bell and the whistle is heard, and I have in a great measure satisfied my desire to see the country. He threw himself into being an excellent porter, the same way he'd thrown himself into being an excellent cowboy. He learned the routes, memorized passenger preferences, provided service that earned him tips. He wrote about the variety of people he met: business tycoons, politicians, entertainers, everyday travelers. The worst tip he ever received, he noted, was 2 cents. The best was $25, supposedly from a member of the Rothschild family. These anecdotes, whether exact or embellished, reveal someone who found dignity and interest in his work, even when it wasn't what he'd chosen. While working for the railroad, Nat and his family moved several times: Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, following where the job took them. Eventually, they settled in Southern California, in Los Angeles. The move west made sense. California represented possibility, a more temperate climate, and a growing economy. Los Angeles was transforming from a frontier town into a real city. For Nat, it was a place where he could build a stable life while holding on to memories of his extraordinary past. By the early 1900s, Nat Love had been out of the cowboy life for more than a decade. He was in his 50s, working steadily for the railroad, raising his family. To the passengers he served, he was just another Pullman porter, polite and efficient, but essentially invisible. They had no idea they were being served by a legend. No idea that the man bringing them coffee and making their beds had once been Deadwood Dick, champion cowboy of the West. No idea he'd survived gunfights and stampedes and adventures that would sound like fiction if you told them. But Nat hadn't forgotten. He carried those memories with him, sharp and clear. And he began to realize something important. His story needed to be told. The West he'd known was disappearing, not just physically, but from memory. The dime novels people read portrayed cowboys as almost exclusively white. The history being written treated black cowboys as footnotes, if they were mentioned at all. Nat Love knew better. He'd been there, he'd lived it, and he decided to do something about it. In 1907, Nat Love published his autobiography, The Life and Adventures of Nat Love, better known in the cattle country as Deadwood Dick by himself. A true history of slavery days, life on the great cattle ranges, and on the plains of the wild and woolly West, based on facts and personal experiences of the author. The title alone tells you something about Nat's personality. Confident, bold, unapologetic. This wasn't a subtle man. This was someone determined to claim his place in history. The book was remarkable for several reasons. First, it was one of the only full-length autobiographies by an African-American cowboy. While thousands of black men had worked the cattle drives, most were illiterate or semi-literate, leaving no written record of their experiences. Nat Love, taught to read and write by his father in defiance of slavery-era laws, could tell his story in his own words. That alone made the book historically significant. Second, the book pulled no punches about slavery and racism. Nat opened with chapters about his birth into bondage, the conditions of slavery, the struggles of his family after emancipation. He didn't sentimentalize the South or suggest slavery was anything other than what it was: a brutal, dehumanizing system. This was published in 1907, during an era when many white Americans were nostalgic for the lost cause mythology of the Noble South. Nat's blunt honesty about slavery was a political act, whether he intended it that way or not. Third, and most controversially, the book was full of dramatic, larger-than-life stories. The Deadwood contest, the capture by Pima warriors and month-long captivity, the encounters with Billy the Kid and other legends, the 14 bullet wounds, the near-death experiences, and miraculous escapes. Critics, both then and now, have questioned whether all of this actually happened as Nat described. Some dismiss the book as essentially fiction, comparing it to the dime novels of the era rather than a legitimate historical document. But here's where it gets interesting. Even the skeptical historians admit that much of what Nat wrote can be verified, or is at least plausible. Did the Deadwood Rodeo happen exactly as he described on exactly that date? Maybe not, though the lack of newspaper coverage doesn't definitively disprove it. Frontier newspapers were notoriously incomplete. Did he meet every famous person he claimed? We can't verify all of them, but we also can't rule them out. Did he survive 14 bullet wounds? Given the primitive medicine of the era, that seems unlikely, though plenty of frontier figures survived multiple serious injuries. What seems clear is that Nat Love did what many frontier figures did. He told his story with flair. He emphasized the dramatic, maybe exaggerated some details, possibly compressed timelines, or combined different incidents into single narratives. In other words, he treated his life the way dime novelists treated fictional characters. And why shouldn't he? The white cowboys who became legends often had their stories similarly embellished. Buffalo Bill Cody built an entire career on exaggerating his exploits. Wild Bill Hickok's reputation outran his actual deeds. The James brothers became folk heroes despite being murderers and thieves. Nat Love was asserting his right to be part of that mythology. He was saying, black cowboys existed. We were skilled. We were brave. We were essential to the settling of the West, and our stories deserve to be told with the same dramatic flair as the white cowboys' stories. If that meant embellishing some details, so be it. The larger truth that he had been a skilled cowboy, had participated in the great cattle drives, had survived and thrived in one of the hardest professions in America. That truth was undeniable. The book also revealed something else: Nat's complicated relationship with race and the frontier. Throughout most of the autobiography, he doesn't dwell on racial issues. He describes his work alongside white, Mexican, and Native American cowboys with a matter-of-fact equality. He presents the range as a place where skill mattered more than skin color, where the bonds between cowboys transcended race. Only in describing certain towns or certain encounters does racism intrude into the narrative. Some modern critics see this as naive, or as downplaying the racism he certainly faced. But another interpretation is that Nat was describing his actual experience. Yes, racism existed everywhere in America. But the frontier, with its unique circumstances, where men's lives depended on trusting each other, where there was no infrastructure to support segregation, where sheer survival required cooperation, the frontier may have offered a temporary and limited form of equality that existed nowhere else in America at that time. Nat wrote, "Mounted on my horse, my lariat near my hand, and my trusty guns in my belt, I felt I could defy the world. That feeling of competence, of freedom, of being judged by what he could do rather than the color of his skin, that's what the West represented to him. Not perfect equality, not the absence of racism, but something closer to a meritocracy than Tennessee or most other places could offer. The autobiography captures that complex reality. The book's publication made Nat Love a black folk hero of the Old West. It gave him a kind of immortality, ensuring that his name and story would survive long after he was gone. It also provided a counter-narrative to the all-white version of cowboy mythology that was dominating American culture. When someone claimed black people had no role in settling the West, here was proof they were wrong. When dime novels portrayed only white cowboys, here was a black cowboy's own account of his life. Did the book make Nat rich? Number. Did it make him famous in the way Buffalo Bill was famous? Number. But it accomplished something perhaps more important. It preserved the truth. Whatever embellishments Nat added for dramatic effect, the core of his story was real and verified. He was born a slave. He went west. He became a skilled cowboy. He earned respect through his abilities. He adapted when his way of life ended. He lived to tell about it. And because he wrote it down, we know his story today. After publishing the book, Nat continued his work with the railroad for several more years. Eventually, he took a position as a security guard with the General Securities Company in Los Angeles. It was steady work, less prestigious than being a Pullman porter, but probably less taxing for a man entering his 60s. He lived quietly with his family, a respected member of the Los Angeles community, a man with an extraordinary past, living an ordinary present. The publication of Nat Love's autobiography in 1907 did something unexpected. It ensured that his legend would grow even after his death. While he lived relatively quietly in Los Angeles for his final years, his book continued to circulate. It was read by young black Americans looking for heroes, by historians trying to understand the full story of the American West, by anyone fascinated by tales of frontier adventure. And slowly, over decades, Deadwood Dick became more than just one man's nickname. It became a symbol. Nat Love died on February 11, 1921 in Los Angeles. He was 66 years old, which was actually a respectable lifespan for someone who'd lived the kind of life he had. Many cowboys died young, thrown from horses, shot in gunfights, trampled in stampedes, or simply worn down by the brutal work. Nat survived into old age, got to see the 20th century well underway, witnessed automobiles replacing horses, saw the Wild West he'd known transform into modern states. He even lived to see the start of Hollywood's obsession with westerns, though those early films featured almost no black cowboys. When he died, Nat's story might have died with him. After all, he was one Pullman porter, one retired cowboy among thousands. His obituary, if there was one, probably rated a few paragraphs in the Los Angeles papers. Nothing special. Nothing to indicate that this man had been one of the most skilled cowboys of his generation. But the book survived, and in the decades after his death, scholars began paying more attention to the contributions of African Americans to Western expansion. The 1960s civil rights movement sparked renewed interest in black history that had been suppressed or forgotten. Historians started asking, where are the black cowboys? Where are the black pioneers? Where are the stories of African Americans who helped build the West? And when they looked, they found Nat Love's autobiography. They found the only full-length account by a black cowboy describing the Great Cattle Drive era from personal experience. Suddenly, Nat Love wasn't just a footnote. He was a primary source. Scholars like Philip Durham and Everett L. Jones, who wrote The Negro Cowboys in 1965, helped bring attention to black cowboys in general, and Nat Love in particular. William Loren Katz's The Black West, first published in 1971, included extensive material on Nat. These historians validated what Nat had been saying all along. Black cowboys were essential to the cattle industry. They comprised roughly 1 in 4 cowboys during the peak years. They drove cattle, handled difficult horses, served as cooks and guides, and even, occasionally, trail bosses. The evidence was overwhelming once people actually looked for it. Old photographs showing racially mixed cowboy crews, census records documenting thousands of black cowboys across western states, brand books listing black ranch owners, oral histories from elderly former cowboys describing their black colleagues. The American West hadn't been the lily-white frontier portrayed in Hollywood. It had been diverse, with significant contributions from African Americans, Mexicans, Native Americans, and various immigrant groups. Nat Love's story fit perfectly into this corrected historical narrative. But Nat's legacy extended beyond academic history. His story inspired artists, writers, and filmmakers. In 1996, the television movie The Cherokee Kid featured a character named Nat Love, portrayed by actor Ernie Hudson. In 2013, the film They Die by Dawn included Nat Love as a character, played by Michael K. Williams. And in 2021, Netflix released The Harder They Fall, a Western starring Jonathan Majors as Nat Love, leader of a gang seeking revenge. The film was pure fiction. Nat Love, the historical figure, wasn't an outlaw, but the filmmakers explicitly chose to name their protagonist after him to honor his legacy. Comic books and graphic novels have also adapted his story. In 2012, Best Shot in the West by Patricia and Frederick McKissick told his story for young readers. In 2022, the Denver Art Museum displayed Nat Love, A Cowboy's Life, a comic adaptation of his autobiography by R. Allen Brooks. These adaptations introduce new generations to Deadwood Dick, ensuring his name survives in popular culture, not just academic texts. What's remarkable about this posthumous fame is how it validates what Nat was trying to do with his autobiography. He wasn't just telling his personal story. He was claiming space for black cowboys in American mythology. He was insisting that the narrative of the West include people who looked like him. And over time, culture has caught up with his vision. Modern portrayals of the Old West increasingly acknowledge its racial diversity. Museums dedicated to black cowboys have opened in Colorado, Texas, and other states. Rodeo organizations like the Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo celebrate black cowboy heritage. The Oakland Black Cowboy Association, founded in 1975, holds an annual Black Cowboy Parade that attracts thousands. The Compton Cowboys in Los Angeles, founded in 1988, keep the tradition alive while mentoring urban youth. The Federation of Black Cowboys in New York, established in 1994, educates the public about black cowboy history. All of these organizations, consciously or not, carry forward the legacy that Nat Love fought to preserve. They prove that being a black cowboy isn't ancient history. It's a living tradition. Historians continue to debate aspects of Nat's autobiography. Did every event happen exactly as described? Probably not. Did he embellish some stories? Almost certainly. But increasingly, scholars acknowledge that dismissing his book as pure fiction misses the point. Even if some details are exaggerated, the book provides invaluable insight into the life of a black cowboy, the culture of the cattle drives, and the racial dynamics of the frontier. It's a document that deserves to be read critically, but also respected for its unique perspective. The larger truth, the one beyond debates about specific dates or whether certain meetings happened, is that Nat Love represents thousands of black cowboys whose names we'll never know. For every Nat Love who left a written record, there were dozens or hundreds who died unknown, their contributions unrecorded. Nat's decision to write his autobiography, whatever its flaws or exaggerations, means that at least one black cowboy's voice survived to tell the story. At least one African American man said, clearly and unambiguously, "I was there. I mattered. Remember me." And we have. That's the power of telling your own story. That's why representation matters. That's why Nat Love spent time in his later years writing down his memories, rather than just letting them fade. He understood that if he didn't tell his story, it might be lost forever. Or worse, someone else might tell a version that erased him and cowboys like him from history. So he wrote. And because he wrote, we remember. Beyond the tall tales and the disputed details, who was Nat Love really? What can we know about him as a person, not just as Deadwood Dick the legend? The autobiography gives us glimpses, though always filtered through Nat's own perspective, and shaped by his desire to present himself heroically. But between the lines, a more complex person emerges. First, there's his intelligence. Remember, Nat taught himself advanced literacy despite being born into a system designed to keep him ignorant. He learned multiple languages, English, Spanish, and several Native American tongues. He mastered complex skills from marksmanship to cattle management to navigation by stars. He went from slavery to becoming a brand reader, a position requiring the ability to identify and track hundreds of different cattle brands, essentially a walking database of livestock ownership. None of this happens by accident. Nat Love was smart, observant, and blessed with an excellent memory. Second, there's his work ethic. Every account of his life emphasizes his willingness to practice, to learn, to push himself. When he won that first job by breaking Goodeye, it wasn't just natural talent. It was the result of practicing with colts back in Tennessee, of studying how horses moved and thought, of refusing to give up when thrown. His legendary marksmanship came from countless hours practicing with his revolver until the weapon became an extension of his body. He didn't coast on natural ability. He worked obsessively to be the best. Third, there's his adaptability. Many cowboys couldn't make the transition when the cattle drive era ended. Some became outlaws. Some drifted aimlessly. Some drank themselves to death, unable to cope with the loss of their identity. Nat Love adapted. He didn't love being a Pullman porter. How could he, after the freedom of the range? But he did the work well and found meaning in it. That kind of pragmatic flexibility is rare. Fourth, there's his pride. Nat Love was not a humble man, at least not on the page. He brags about his accomplishments, emphasizes his superiority over other cowboys, claims victories that may or may not have happened as described. Some people find this off-putting, but consider the context. Nat spent his entire life in a society that told him he was inferior because of his skin color. Every day, in countless ways, large and small, America reinforced the message that black people were less capable, less intelligent, less valuable than whites. His pride, his boasting, his insistence on his own excellence, these were acts of resistance. These were him refusing to internalize the racism around him. Fifth, there's his complicated relationship with violence. Nat wrote about gunfights matter-of-factly, without evident guilt or trauma. He killed men, cattle thieves, outlaws, people who threatened him or his crew, and he recounted these incidents as simply part of the job. Modern readers sometimes struggle with this. Shouldn't he have been more troubled by taking human life? But Nat lived in a world where violence was often the difference between survival and death. Hesitation got you killed. Moral complexity was a luxury he couldn't afford. His matter-of-fact attitude toward violence reflects the reality of frontier life, not some moral deficiency. Sixth, there's what the autobiography doesn't say. Nat writes very little about his wife Alice or his family life. He mentions marrying her, notes that they had a child, but provides almost no details about these relationships, his parents, siblings, the family he left behind in Tennessee. They appear in the early chapters, then essentially disappear from the narrative. This could be because he wanted to focus on his adventures, or it could be because discussing his domestic life didn't fit the heroic cowboy image he was crafting. Or perhaps he was simply a private man about certain things. We don't know. What we do know is that Nat Love embodied contradictions that make him human rather than just mythical. He was proud, but had to be subservient as a Pullman porter. He valued the frontier's relative racial equality, but participated in violence against Native Americans defending their land. He championed black cowboy contributions while sometimes distancing himself from discussions of racism. He told his story boldly, but probably embellished parts of it. He was a real person, complicated and imperfect, trying to survive and thrive in difficult circumstances. Perhaps the most telling aspect of Nat's character is his persistence. Think about the obstacles he faced, born into slavery with every door closed to him. Left home at 15 with $50 and no safety net. Entered a profession that killed many men through accident or violence. Faced racism even in the relatively egalitarian cowboy world. Watched his profession become obsolete and had to reinvent himself. Through all of this, he never quit. He never accepted other people's limitations on what he could achieve. That persistence, more than any specific accomplishment, defines who Nat Love was. There's also his obvious love for the cowboy life. When he writes about riding the range, his prose becomes almost poetic. Mounted on my horse, my lariat near my hand, and my trusty guns in my belt, I felt I could defy the world. That's not boasting. That's genuine emotion. The frontier gave him something precious, a sense of freedom and competence that slavery had denied him, and that racism limited everywhere else. When he writes about the cattle drives ending, you can feel his grief. Not just nostalgia, but genuine mourning for a way of life that had allowed him to be fully himself. This emotional honesty, scattered throughout the autobiography, might be the most authentic thing about it. Whatever details Nat exaggerated, his love for the cowboy life was real. His pride in his accomplishments was real. His belief that he deserved to be remembered alongside the white cowboys was real. And his determination to tell his story, to insist on his place in history, to refuse to be forgotten, that was profoundly, undeniably real. In the end, Nat Love was a survivor, who became a champion, who became a legend. He was a man who refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose on him. He was someone who saw an opportunity, the frontier, and seized it with both hands. He was a storyteller who understood that controlling your own narrative matters, that if you don't tell your story, someone else will tell a lesser version of it. He was proud, skilled, brave, and determined. He was also human, flawed, probably dishonest about some details, and caught up in systems of violence and oppression that none of us would want to experience. He was, in other words, a complete human being. Not a simple hero or victim, but something more complex, and therefore more interesting. That's who Nat Love really was. And that's the man we should remember. Nat Love's significance extends far beyond his personal accomplishments. To understand his true impact, we need to examine what he represented for Black Americans and how his story fit into the larger struggle for equality and recognition. His life, in many ways, was both typical and exceptional. Typical in that he faced racism and limited opportunities. Exceptional in how he responded to those limitations. Let's start with representation. In the decades after the Civil War, as America was trying to define itself, the mythology of the West became central to American identity. The cowboy became an icon, the independent, self-reliant American hero taming a wild frontier. But this mythology was almost exclusively white. The dime novels, the Wild West shows, the early films, they portrayed cowboys as white men, with occasional Mexican sidekicks and Native American antagonists. Black people, when they appeared at all, were typically shown as servants or comic relief, never as skilled cowboys in their own right. This erasure was deliberate. During the era of Jim Crow, when African Americans were being systematically denied rights and dignity, it served the racist establishment to pretend that Black people had contributed nothing to the settling of the West. If cowboys were all white, if the heroes who tamed the frontier were all white, then it reinforced the narrative that white people built America, while Black people were merely passive beneficiaries of white civilization. This lie was taught in schools, reinforced in popular culture, and believed by millions. Nat Love's autobiography was a direct challenge to this lie. Here was a Black man saying, clearly and unambiguously, "I was there. I wasn't a servant or a sidekick. I was a champion. I competed against white cowboys and beat them. I survived dangers that killed other men. I earned respect through skill. I was part of building the West. You can't erase me from this history because I'm writing it down for you to read." That act of writing, of claiming space in the historical record, was fundamentally political, even if Nat didn't frame it that way. His story mattered to Black Americans because it provided a different kind of hero. The early 20th century offered few positive representations of black men in mainstream American culture. When black people appeared in films and literature, they were typically shown as buffoons, criminals, or servants, never as competent, skilled professionals worthy of respect. Nat Love's autobiography said otherwise. Here was a black man who was excellent at a highly valued profession. Here was someone who'd earned his place through talent and determination. For young black readers, this was inspiring. It said, "You can be more than what racist society says you can be." The timing of his autobiography is significant. Published in 1907, it came at a low point in black American history. The promises of Reconstruction had been betrayed. Jim Crow laws had been established across the South. The Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision had enshrined separate but equal as the law of the land, giving legal sanction to segregation. Lynching was epidemic. Black Americans were being systematically stripped of voting rights, economic opportunities, and basic human dignity. In this context, Nat Love's story of competence, success, and respect earned through excellence provided a counter-narrative to the racism that surrounded black Americans. But Nat Love's impact wasn't just symbolic. He was part of a larger truth about black contributions to the West that historians would later verify. When scholars finally examined the evidence, they found that roughly 25% of cowboys, somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000 individuals, were black. This wasn't a trivial contribution. Black cowboys were essential to the cattle industry that drove Western economic development. They broke horses, drove cattle, served as cooks and scouts, and in some cases became ranch owners themselves. Nat Love's story was part of this larger truth, and his decision to write it down helped ensure that future generations could recover that truth. Moreover, Nat Love's life demonstrated something important about the nature of freedom and opportunity for black Americans. The frontier, for all its dangers and hardships, offered something the South never could: a meritocracy, however limited and imperfect. On the cattle drive, when your life depended on the competence of the men around you, skin color mattered less than skill. Cowboys worked alongside each other regardless of race, because survival demanded cooperation. This didn't eliminate racism. Discrimination certainly existed in the cattle towns and in many other aspects of Western life, but it created spaces where black men could earn respect and advancement based on ability. This matters because it challenges the notion that racism was inevitable or natural. If cowboys of different races could work together effectively, if a black man like Nat Love could become a champion roper and shooter respected by his peers, then racism was clearly a choice, not a biological reality. The frontier demonstrated that when circumstances demanded cooperation and valued competence, racial barriers could be overcome. This lesson would resonate through the civil rights movement and beyond. Nat Love also represented the Great Exodus, the migration of black Americans from the South to the West in search of opportunity. Thousands of formerly enslaved people and their children headed west after the Civil War, drawn by the possibility of land ownership through the Homestead Act, by employment opportunities in mining and ranching, by the hope of escaping Southern racism. Some succeeded, establishing black communities like Nicodemus, Kansas. Others failed, discovering that racism existed in the West too, just in different forms. Nat was one of the success stories, but his story was made possible by this larger movement of black Americans seeking something better. His transition from cowboy to Pullman porter also reflects important aspects of black economic history. When the cowboy era ended, many black cowboys struggled to find equivalent work. Some returned to the South. Some took low-wage labor jobs. Nat became a Pullman porter, which was actually one of the better employment options available to black men in the early 20th century. The Pullman Company employed more black men than any other single employer at the time. It paid relatively well, offered steady work, and provided a degree of economic security. But it also enforced strict rules of subservience, requiring porters to tolerate racist treatment from passengers with forced smiles. Nat's experience as a porter reflects the reality that even successful black Americans had to navigate racist systems that limited their opportunities and demanded their deference. His legacy also intersects with questions of black masculinity. During the Jim Crow era, black men were often depicted as either dangerous threats to be controlled or as emasculated, non-threatening figures, suitable only for servile roles. The cowboy, strong, independent, skilled with weapons, commanding respect, represented a form of masculinity that mainstream white society wanted to deny to black men. Nat Love's story challenged this. He claimed the cowboy identity unapologetically. He presented himself as tough, skilled, brave, all qualities associated with idealized masculinity, while also being black. This was, in its way, a radical act. When we assess Nat Love's impact on black American history, we have to acknowledge both what he represented and what he couldn't accomplish. He was one man, and one man's success doesn't eliminate systemic racism. Other black cowboys remained anonymous, their contributions unrecorded. The cattle industry's relative equality didn't extend to other industries, or to society at large. Nat's fame, such as it was, didn't translate into broader opportunities for other black Americans. But he did something important. He preserved a story that would have been lost. He created a historical record that future generations could point to. He proved that black Americans had been cowboys, had been skilled, had been essential to building the West. That proof matters. It matters when textbooks are written. It matters when films are made. It matters when young people ask what their ancestors contributed to America. It matters when racist voices try to claim that black Americans have no history of achievement or contribution beyond slavery. Nat Love, by telling his story, made sure those lies could be challenged. He made sure there was evidence. And that evidence has inspired generations of historians, artists, and ordinary people to look deeper, to question the sanitized version of history they were taught, to recover the full story of who built America. When we zoom out from Nat Love's individual story to look at the broader context, we see how his life intersects with crucial themes in American history. His existence challenges fundamental narratives about race, the West, and American identity. Let's examine these deeper implications. First, there's the myth of the American West itself. For generations, Americans were taught that the West was settled primarily by white pioneers, that the frontier represented white Americans conquering wilderness and bringing civilization. This myth wasn't accidental. It served to justify the displacement of Native Americans and to reinforce white supremacy. If whites alone tamed the frontier, then they deserved to rule it. Nat Love's story, along with those of thousands of other black cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, Chinese railroad workers, and Native American scouts, demolishes this myth. The West was settled by a diverse coalition of peoples, all contributing essential skills and labor. The recovery of this truth has been a long process, accelerating in recent decades as historians have paid more attention to previously marginalized voices. Nat Love's autobiography has been central to this recovery. It's not just that he was there, it's that he left a first-person account. Primary sources matter enormously in historical scholarship, and having a black cowboy's own words, his own perspective on events, his own assessment of his skills and accomplishments, that's invaluable. It prevents his story from being filtered entirely through white perspectives or dismissed as merely anecdotal. Second, there's the question of meritocracy. America has always claimed to be a land where hard work and talent determine success. But America has also systematically denied opportunities to people of color, creating a contradiction between stated ideals and lived reality. The frontier, in some ways, came closer to genuine meritocracy than other parts of American society. Not perfectly, discrimination certainly existed, but more so than the South or even many northern cities. On a cattle drive, incompetent cowboys got people killed, so there was real pressure to judge men by their abilities, rather than their skin color. Nat Love's success demonstrates that when black Americans were given even limited opportunities to prove themselves, they excelled. They could compete and win. They could master difficult skills. They could earn respect from peers who initially doubted them. This suggests that the failures of black Americans in other contexts weren't due to any inherent inferiority, the racist explanation offered by many whites, but rather due to systems designed to prevent their success. The frontier's relative equality proved that racism was the problem, not black capabilities. Third, there's the issue of cultural memory and historical erasure. For decades, Nat Love's story was largely forgotten. His autobiography went out of print. Western films and television shows featured no black cowboys. History textbooks ignored or minimized black contributions to Western settlement. This erasure was deliberate. Maintaining white supremacy required controlling the historical narrative. If Americans believed that only whites had contributed to building the nation, then denying rights to black Americans seemed more justified. The recovery of Nat Love's story is part of a larger project of historical recovery that began during the Civil Rights Movement and continues today. Museums dedicated to black cowboys have opened. Scholars have written books documenting black contributions to Western expansion. Filmmakers have created works featuring black cowboys. This recovery matters because it changes how Americans understand their own history. It reveals that the nation was always more diverse, more complex, and more indebted to people of color than the sanitized narrative acknowledged. Fourth, there's the theme of adaptation and survival. Nat Love lived through multiple eras: slavery, emancipation, Reconstruction, the Wild West, the Progressive Era, World War I, and into the early 1920s. Each era brought new challenges and required new strategies. Born a slave, he became a free man. A free man with nothing, he became a skilled cowboy. When that profession disappeared, he became a railroad porter. He constantly adapted, constantly found new ways to survive and even thrive. This pattern of adaptation mirrors the broader Black American experience, constantly navigating systems designed to limit or destroy them, constantly finding ways to endure and progress despite obstacles. His story also illustrates the cost of that adaptation. To succeed as a Pullman porter, Nat had to set aside his pride and defer to white passengers. To survive on the frontier, he participated in violence against Native Americans. To publish his story, he probably embellished some details to make it more marketable. None of these compromises were ideal, but they were necessary for survival. This moral complexity, the reality that survival often requires compromises that pure idealists would reject, is important to acknowledge. It doesn't diminish Nat's accomplishments. It makes them more human and more relatable. Fifth, there's the power of storytelling itself. Nat Love understood something crucial. If you don't tell your own story, someone else will tell it for you, and they'll probably get it wrong. By writing his autobiography, by claiming the Deadwood Dick nickname, by presenting himself boldly and unapologetically, he took control of his narrative. He didn't wait for historians to discover him. He didn't rely on others to validate his experiences. He said, "Here I am. This is what I did. Remember me." That act of self-assertion, of refusing to be erased, is itself a form of resistance. The lesson extends beyond Nat Love to broader questions of representation and voice. Who gets to tell history? Whose stories are preserved? And whose are lost? For too long, history was written primarily by white people about white people, with people of color appearing mainly as objects of white action rather than as subjects of their own stories. Nat Love's autobiography disrupts this pattern. It's a black man telling his own story in his own words. Whatever its limitations, that matters. Sixth, there's the ongoing relevance of his story. Why does Nat Love's tale resonate today, more than a century after he wrote it? Partly because the issues he navigated, racism, limited opportunity, the need to prove yourself against doubters, the struggle for recognition and respect, remain relevant. Black Americans still face skepticism about their abilities. They still have to work harder to receive the same recognition as white counterparts. They're still fighting to have their contributions to American history properly acknowledged. But there's also something inspirational about Nat's story that transcends specific historical circumstances. Here was someone born into the worst possible circumstances, literally enslaved, declared property rather than person, who refused to accept society's limitations. He left home at 15 with almost nothing. He entered a dangerous profession and mastered it. He competed against the best and won. He wrote his own story and ensured it would survive. There's a universality to that journey that speaks to anyone facing obstacles, anyone told they can't achieve something, anyone fighting to be recognized for who they are and what they've accomplished. Finally, Nat Love's legacy lives on in the black cowboys and cowgirls of today. Organizations like the Oakland Black Cowboy Association, the Compton Cowboys, and the Federation of Black Cowboys explicitly connect themselves to the history of black cowboys in the 19th century. They keep the tradition alive while also providing mentorship and opportunities for young people. Rodeos, like the Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo, celebrate black cowboy heritage. These modern expressions of black cowboy culture aren't just nostalgia, they're living traditions that connect past to present. When members of these organizations put on their cowboy hats and boots, when they ride in parades or compete in rodeos, they're embodying the legacy that Nat Love helped preserve. They're saying, "We were always here. We've always been cowboys. This is our history too." And that message, that insistence on claiming space in American culture and history, that's Nat Love's ultimate legacy. He helped ensure that future generations of black Americans could point to the cowboy tradition and say, "That's ours. We helped create it. We belong in that story." As we approach the end of Nat Love's story, it's worth considering what lessons his life offers to us today. These aren't simple moral lessons. Nat was too complex a figure for that, but rather insights drawn from examining how he navigated his challenges and built his legacy. First, there's the lesson about taking control of your own narrative. Nat Love didn't wait for someone to discover him and tell his story. He didn't hope that historians would eventually recognize his contributions. He wrote his own autobiography, with his own perspective, emphasizing what he thought was important. Was the result perfect? Number. Did he probably exaggerate some details? Almost certainly. But he ensured that his voice, his perspective, his version of events was preserved. In an era when black voices were routinely suppressed or ignored, that act of self-assertion was crucial. This lesson remains relevant today, in an age of social media and personal branding. You have more ability than ever to tell your own story, to present yourself to the world on your own terms. But it requires actually doing it, putting yourself out there, risking criticism, refusing to be silent. Nat Love didn't have the advantage of modern technology, but he had something equally important: the determination to be heard. Second, there's the lesson about skill as a form of resistance. Nat Love didn't defeat racism by arguing with racists or trying to convince them they were wrong. He defeated doubters by being undeniably excellent at what he did. When he won the Deadwood contest, when he demonstrated skills that surpassed his white competitors, he made it impossible to dismiss him. Arguments can be ignored. Excellence demands recognition. This doesn't mean injustice should be accepted or that people shouldn't fight against discrimination through activism and advocacy. But it does suggest that exceptional competence is its own form of power. Third, there's the lesson about adaptability. Nat's life required multiple reinventions. Slave became free person. Tennessee farm worker became Western cowboy. Cowboy became Pullman porter. Each transition required learning new skills, adopting new behaviors, accepting new realities. He didn't cling to the past or refuse to change when circumstances demanded it. This kind of adaptability is crucial in a world that changes rapidly. The ability to reinvent yourself, to find new opportunities when old ones disappear, to remain valuable and relevant as conditions shift. These are timeless skills. Fourth, there's the lesson about the power of documentation and primary sources. Nat Love's autobiography has become increasingly valuable over time because it's a first-person account. Historians can debate his accuracy, but they can't dismiss his existence or his perspective. This highlights why preserving stories, recording experiences, and creating documentation matters. Future generations need to know what happened, how people lived, what they thought and felt. Every person who writes down their experiences, who preserves family stories, who documents their communities, is doing important work. Fifth, there's the lesson about finding dignity in difficult circumstances. As a Pullman porter, Nat had to show deference to white passengers, some of whom probably treated him with contempt. Yet he found ways to maintain his self-respect. He excelled at the job. He took pride in providing good service. He remembered who he really was, Deadwood Dick, champion cowboy, even when his passengers saw only a porter. This ability to maintain internal dignity, regardless of external circumstances, is crucial for anyone who has to navigate systems that don't properly respect them. Sixth, there's the lesson about the importance of context. Nat's story reminds us that people's actions have to be understood within their historical context. He participated in violence against Native Americans, which, from our modern perspective, seems troubling. But he was living in an era and a place where such conflicts were routine, where survival often depended on fighting. We can acknowledge this moral complexity without either excusing it or using it to dismiss his entire story. People are products of their times, while also transcending them in some ways. Understanding this helps us think more clearly about historical figures and about our own moral choices. Seventh, there's the lesson about the long game. Nat Love died in 1921, relatively unknown outside his immediate community. His autobiography had been published, but wasn't widely read. He might have seemed like a failure by conventional measures, someone whose 15 minutes of fame as Deadwood Dick had long since passed, someone who finished life as a security guard rather than a celebrated hero. But his legacy grew after his death. The book he wrote became more valuable over time. His story inspired people he never met. The legacy he created outlasted his life. Sometimes the impact of your actions isn't immediately apparent. Sometimes you plant seeds that take decades to bear fruit. Eighth, there's the lesson about representation and visibility. Nat Love mattered not just because of what he accomplished, but because he made black cowboys visible. He proved they existed. He showed that the mythology of the West needed to include diverse faces. This matters because people can't be what they can't see. When young black Americans today learn about Nat Love and other black cowboys, it expands their sense of possibility. It says, your ancestors did this. You come from people who were skilled and brave and essential. You belong in every aspect of American history, not just the parts dealing with slavery and civil rights. Ninth, there's the lesson about pride. Nat Love was not humble. He boasted about his accomplishments. He claimed a legendary nickname. He presented himself as the best. Some people found this off-putting, both in his time and today. But consider, he lived in a society that constantly told him he was inferior. His pride was armor against that message. His boasting was a refusal to internalize racism. His claims to excellence were necessary pushback against a culture that denied black achievement. Sometimes pride isn't arrogance, it's survival. Finally, there's the lesson about the complexity of historical truth. Nat Love's autobiography isn't perfectly accurate. It includes embellishments, probably some outright fabrications, and certainly a lot of unverifiable claims. Does this mean we should dismiss it? Number. It means we should read it critically, understanding what kind of document it is. A man in his 50s looking back on his youth, telling stories that emphasize the dramatic and downplay the mundane, shaping his life into a narrative that makes sense and has meaning. That's what humans do. We don't remember our lives as raw data. We remember them as stories. Nat's autobiography is his story, and even where it deviates from pure fact, it contains emotional truth and historical value. These lessons aren't prescriptions. They're observations drawn from one remarkable life. Your circumstances will differ from Nat Love's, but the fundamental challenges he faced, proving yourself when others doubt you, adapting to changing circumstances, claiming your place in history, maintaining dignity under pressure, these are universal. However different our era is from his, we can still learn from how he navigated his challenges. we can still be inspired by his refusal to accept limitations. We can still apply his strategies to our own struggles. Let's return to where we started. July 4th, 1876, Deadwood, Dakota Territory. A young black cowboy stepping into a contest against the best the frontier had to offer. The crowd watching skeptically, the competitors underestimating him, the impossible expectations placed on someone who'd been born a slave in a nation that declared him less than human. And then the performance. 9 minutes to rope, saddle, and mount a wild mustang. 14 perfect shots from 250 yards. Excellence so undeniable that even doubters had to acknowledge it. That moment crystallizes everything Nat Love's life represented. The refusal to be limited by society's expectations. The power of skill to command respect. The possibility of transcending the circumstances of your birth. Nat Love lived 66 years. He was born a slave and died a free man who'd seen automobiles replace horses, who'd watched the Wild West transform into modern states, who'd lived through the worst era of American racism while still carving out a life of dignity and accomplishment. He left behind a written record of his experiences, ensuring that future generations would know black cowboys had existed, had been essential, had been champions. His autobiography, whatever its embellishments, preserved a truth that would otherwise have been lost. Today, more than a century after his death, Nat Love's legacy is secure. His name appears in history books. His story inspires films and graphic novels. Organizations dedicated to black cowboy heritage invoke his name. When people discuss the diversity of the Old West, Nat Love is Exhibit A, proof that the frontier was more racially diverse than Hollywood portrayed, that black Americans were essential to settling the West, that the mythology of the cowboy must include diverse faces. In museums from Colorado to Texas, his photograph appears alongside other cowboy legends. His autobiography remains in print, studied by scholars and read by anyone interested in authentic frontier history. But beyond the formal legacy, beyond the museums and academic studies, Nat Love's story offers something more personal and immediate. Inspiration. It says that no matter how limited your starting point, you can achieve extraordinary things. It says that skill and determination can overcome prejudice, if not completely then enough to matter. It says that taking control of your own narrative, telling your own story, claiming your own place in history, these acts have power. It says that excellence is the best response to doubt. It says that adapting to changing circumstances is better than clinging to a past that no longer exists. It says that one life, lived with purpose and courage, can echo across generations. Think about what Nat Love's life meant in practical terms. A boy born into slavery, taught to read and write in violation of the law, lost his father as a teenager, left home at 15 with $50 and no safety net, entered one of the most dangerous professions in America, survived everything the frontier could throw at him, became a champion recognized even by those who didn't want to acknowledge him, adapted when his profession disappeared, raised a family, wrote a book ensuring his story would survive, and died having lived fully and freely in ways his parents could barely have imagined. That journey, from slavery to legend, is not fiction. It's documented history. It happened. He did it. And if he could do it, with all the obstacles he faced, what excuse do we have for not pursuing our own potential? What excuse for letting others define our limitations? What excuse for failing to tell our own stories, to claim our own accomplishments, to demand our own place in whatever field we choose to enter? Nat Love didn't have advantages. He had obstacles that would have crushed most people. But he also had determination, skill, and the absolute refusal to accept what society said he couldn't do. Those qualities, determination, skill, refusing to accept limitations, are available to anyone willing to develop them. His story also challenges us to ask difficult questions about our own society. Who are we underestimating today? What talented people are we overlooking because they don't fit our preconceptions? What modern equivalent of Nat Love is being denied opportunities because of their race, gender, class, nationality, or some other arbitrary category? And what are we losing as a society when we let prejudice limit human potential? These questions mattered in 1876, and they matter now. Nat Love's story doesn't just teach us about the past, it challenges us to do better in the present. The outlaws who once roamed the Old West are long gone. The vast cattle drives have ended. The frontier has been settled, civilized, transformed. But Nat Love's story persists. It persists because he wrote it down. It persists because it speaks to fundamental human experiences, the desire for freedom, the need to prove yourself, the search for respect and dignity. It persists because every generation rediscovers it and finds new meaning in it. It persists because it's true, and truth has a way of surviving, even when people try to bury it. So remember the name, Nat Love, Deadwood Dick, born into slavery. June 14, 1854. Died a free man, February 11, 1921. Champion roper and shooter. Master cowboy who drove cattle from the Gulf of Mexico to Montana. A man who claimed his place in American mythology and refused to be erased from history. A man who proved definitively and undeniably that a black man could be a cowboy. And not just a cowboy, but one of the very best the frontier ever produced. They said it couldn't be done. They said someone born into slavery had no business competing with white cowboys, claiming legendary status, becoming a hero of the West. They laughed at the very idea. And Nat Love proved every single doubter wrong. He roped faster, shot straighter, rode harder, and survived longer than most of the men who questioned whether he belonged. And then he wrote it all down, ensuring that his story, and by extension the story of all black cowboys, would not be forgotten. The badge Bass Reeves wore is in a museum. The trails where cattle drives once occurred are now highways. The Wild West exists only in memory and in the stories we tell. But the lesson of Nat Love's life remains fresh and relevant. Excellence is the ultimate answer to doubt. Determination can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable. Your story matters, but only if you tell it. And no matter what society says you can't do, you have the power to prove them wrong. That's the legacy of Deadwood Dick. That's the story of Nat Love. And that's why, more than a century after his death, we still speak his name. Because he earned it. Because he documented it. Because he refused to be forgotten. And because his story, his life, his example still has something important to teach us about courage, excellence, and the power of claiming your own place in history. Remember the name, tell the story, and never, ever accept someone else's limitations on what you can achieve. That's what Nat Love would want. That's the message his life delivers across the decades. That's why his legend lives on. Deadwood Dick rode his last trail more than 100 years ago. But the spirit that made him a legend, the refusal to be defined by circumstances, the determination to excel regardless of obstacles, the courage to tell your own story, that spirit is timeless. It's available to anyone willing to embrace it. And that might be the greatest legacy of all. Not just that Nat Love was remarkable, but that his example shows us how we too can be remarkable in our own way. How we too can refuse to accept limitations. How we too can claim our own place in history. They said a black man couldn't be a cowboy. Nat Love proved them wrong. What will you prove wrong? What limitations will you refuse to accept? What story will you write for yourself? These are the questions his life asks us to consider. And in answering them, in living boldly and refusing to be limited by others' prejudices, we honor his legacy. We become, in our own way, the next generation of people who refuse to be told what they cannot do. That's the power of one life, lived well and documented for posterity. That's why history matters, and that's why we'll keep telling Nat Love's story for generations to come.